show. No matter what I've done in the last, since the 70s when I started working with glass, it's always been from a painter's point of view, and I've been painting in the space of glass, in that ambiguous space of glass in many different ways. So just my background is in painting, I'm self-taught in glass, and when I had we had a studio that ended up being quite large called Renaissance Glass Company in Austin, Texas. And we did a lot of leaded glass, we did so many commissions. I was the designer and my partner could figure out anything with, I'd come up with an idea and say, well, we can do this and we can make that. And we had, at one point, 14 artists working for us, various people. So it was something where we had to actually make money to support all these. And I developed a whole glass community down there because they were allowed to use our studio for nights and weekends to make their own work. So I love that, it was just sort of, and then several of those people have gone on to, but these are some commissions that I did. This was for an educational wing in Houston. It was a memorial window of a Catholic church. This was for the Wiseman Cafe at the Jewish Museum in New York. And there were 6, it's really hard to photograph these, but they're light boxes basically. But each one had to do with the blessings. And I worked with Norman Kleeblatt, and also a committee. I did so many designs, I can't tell you, for this, to get these 6, and they were about the blessings. Jacob's Ladder and how people choose the holidays based on the phases of the moon and the sun, and that's a detail of the Wailing Wall. It could also be about menstrual cycles, I'm not sure. But, so these were pieces that I did that I called a hybrid. I felt like I was trying to break away from architecture and doing leaded glass for architecture. I've always been concerned with dealing with all these different ways that, in this case, the glass is held together by lead. It's basically stained glass. And the rondelles were hand blown for me by Bill Morris. And there's some lead in there that's 3 inches wide, so I was carving that and drilling it. So there's clear glass, distorted glass, opaque glass, glass that you could, so it was like your eye could flow through it, your eye would stop at the plane, your eye would be reflected, the light would be reflected back at you. So this ambiguous plane of here's the glass, but all the ways that you could see it were, that's what I was interested in. There's beveled glass in here. And so that was like 1984. This is because I did those freestanding screens, which I showed at galleries. And they mostly sold. This was for Jerry and Simona Chazen, the main supporters of the Museum of Art and Design. So these are, more examples of these screens, and they're very tasteful, and people loved them. And probably I could have continued to work in this manner and been more successful than I am today. I mean, but I just.
You mean they were more commercially successful?
More commercially successful, yes, thank you. Thank God you're here. So I was doing these screens, and at the same time I was doing architectural commissions, and then, but in the early 80s, 1979, I decided that I was going to be an artist who worked with glass, and it was like Xing out. I decided to X out all ways of looking at glass, and as I said, I started inviting all these artists, Paul Marioni, Narcissus Qualiata, Patrick Renchins, Dale Chihuly, Charlie Perriott, Christopher Lee, Bill Morris. I asked them to come down to Austin various times. And they came, and I learned a lot from them, and they endorsed my work. And so it was kind of like I entered the national scene because of all that activity and because of the work. So this is the first X called the Hexaplex X. And again, this was very radical at the time for me. There's this whole hierarchy of what glasses you buy and use. Most of the glasses are glasses that you have to buy from manufacturers. So there's cheap glass, expensive glass, hand-blown glass, and to put them all together was just shocking somehow. And it seems ridiculous now. And then I also was painting on the leads and adding glitter, and so I wanted the piece to be one thing at night. Yeah, that's the same pieces up there. It's called Hexaplex X because it has 6 sections of glass. And I wanted it to be one thing at night and one thing during the day. So this idea of transmitted and reflected light was very important to me. This is septiplex X. Now these are still rectangles, so they're still paying homage to the idea of architecture, that there's a space that this rectangle might fit. This is I really tried to do something ugly on this one. This is called the ugly X, or undecaplex X, which is 11 sections. This is actually painted and fired. I usually avoided anything that was permanent, all the regular ways of dealing with glass. I wanted to work with cheap materials. This is called the X-Love Goddess. So, it was about telling, the history of stained glass is that it has a narrative, it has a story that usually was conveyed via 12th century churches. So the story here is like opulence, indulgence. This was a beheaded, figurine I bought at a dime store. She's like, sort of like a Greek or Roman statue with a feathered top, like she was a stripper or something. So that, on this rug that might be like an exotic flying carpet or something, but it was about emotions and overdoing and pattern and decoration. This is the Neo Nouveau X. It was, this Venetian mirror that was falling apart that I took apart and then combined it with some of the ugliest glasses, what I thought were ugly, and then fired on commercial decals that were used by women mostly in the 50s and 60s to decorate cups and different, beautification projects for their for tableware and the like. So I was playing with craft being, going to craft and five and dime stores for craft materials, because the whole thing about craft was a big, it still is unfortunately an issue. So I was going crazy with violating stained glass, which really it's like the low person on the totem pole in terms of the whole craft world. Blown glass, was at that time sort of the high point, but ceramics, everything else was pretty much higher than stained glass. So I had a heyday fucking around with it, basically. So my first year at Pilchuck, I was a TA for Paul. I don't really have any good pictures of us from back then, but I was introduced to working with blown glass, and I worked with I didn't know, some of the best people were my gaffers. It's Bill Morris on the right, and Flora Mace and Joey Kirkpatrick, helping make one of my Venetian goblets for Texas Kings. This was the first X vessel, I called it, where I told them to rip it up and gluing Kugler color on the bottom. And again, at the time, at Pilchuck, there was still this sort of Pilchuck Glass School, which is north of Seattle. There was still this idea about purity to materials, and so a lot of people, even like the De La Torre brothers, were very happy to see me doing this, because then they said, oh, it's okay, we all kind of helped each other. It's okay to add other materials to the glass. So this is my first year teaching. I was teaching glass and mixed media, which was like it was a free-for-all. I never knew what they were going to make, but it was good. It was fun. So these are a couple of the Venetian goblets for Texas Kings, which were like 1982. Here's Dale Chihuly, who's the founder of the Pilchuck Glass School, coming through and just putting one of the Venetian goblets on his head. So this is exfoliation, sort of like nature dressed up for a cocktail party. A lot of pattern. I wanted to do a piece. My stipulation was that it had to be all in green. And here's a detail of gluing on jewels and plastics and costume jewelry. But thinking about them in the same way as like a dab of paint, but it was creating this optical and animated surface. I started to move away from the X's. This is Running Woman in X Fence, and it's about my best friend and I, and it's got a lot of fabrics. She's a clothes designer. In fact, this is her shirt. But we've traded clothes for art over the years. She's a big collector. So that's Running Woman in X Fence, and actually the Museum of Art and Design just acquired this one recently. So that's this is a show at the Beatrice Wood Center for the Arts, and it was my husband and I. It was called Retro Perspectives, and it was work from the 70s and 80s that we had done without knowing each other, before we knew each other. That's Excited X, and he actually did some paintings on glass. That's his on the right. The Pilchuck Glass School, I mean, it is a big deal for me. That was really kind of my alma mater. This is Tom Buechner, who was the director of the Corning Museum of Glass at that time, and he would come as a visiting artist. And I took my class, and we went, Pilchuck was on a tree farm, and so they cut down the trees and then they burn, you know, once they take all the valuable parts, they burn it to, you know, recycle the whole earth and all of that. So we'd go to these places sometimes after, when school was happening too, and they would still be smoking. But these stumps have a whole history around the campus of they're alive, and then they're cut, and then they're burned, and then they rot, and then out of the tree stump comes a new bush. So it's about regeneration and new life. So that new tree comes out of the dead tree, which is never really dead. So I did these, this is called the burnt bush. I did that at Pilchuck. And then this was, I did several of them. I don't have a picture of all of them, but then this one is Chernobyl Cocktail, which is the stump with a bush, except that it kind of mutated into a, yeah, like a radiation.
And that's right there.
Yeah, and that's right here, right. So it still has leaded glass, but it's also mounted on wood, and it has paint. So it's various techniques, and then, so the stump, the regenerating life out of the stump became, you know, the radioactive cylinder with a flame coming out of it with the dead bird. It's called Flying Away. And the thing is I was working on this before, right as the Chernobyl crisis happened. So I wasn't, it was like I had just tuned into something that was happening. So I called it that. I don't know, anyway. So this is at the Corning Museum of Glass. It's called Bacchante Texana, which is sort of a celebrant. It's a self-portrait of sorts. Been influenced by, you know, Picasso and the Cubists and the design world of the 20s and 30s, juxtaposition of forms. In 1988, 87, I met my husband. He was doing a film in Austin, and he commissioned me to do some glass for a movie, a remake of the Dead on Arrival, DOA, with Charlotte Rampling and Dennis Quaid. And so I did these windows for the sets. They wanted a door that they could film a murder scene through. So anyway, I asked him out, and then we're going back and forth. And so I was ready for a change, and so I sold my business, sold my home, and moved to LA in 1988. And when I got here, I didn't have any glass equipment really, so I was still working, I had a show coming up. And so I started thinking about trying to be, I don't know, you know, I had trying to make the work more like paint, have more paint, real paint in it. So these are they're wood constructions that have various paints on them, and then almost like a mosaic, various mosaic techniques. So applied. So it was like a skin, a almost three-dimensional skin clad with glass and other materials. Actually, pretty much glass and paint, really. So this is called the Palais des Embryonic Arabesques. I was pregnant at the time, so that little arabesque in the middle was kind of like my womb, my son. So, you know, I was affected a lot. You know, I was in Texas, but I was affected by artists like Judy Pfaff and Elizabeth Murray, and mostly traveled to LA, to New York to see art rather than LA. I never thought I'd move to the West Coast. But anyway, that's just an aside that just that activity of, you know, Julian Schnabel putting ceramics inside of paint and all of that was, you know, that was big for me at the time. And Frank Stella's early work and Judy Pfaff's early installations where all kinds of mixed media would consume a room. So, you know, that hybrid thinking of being like a painter, thinking about the history of art and current art, and then being also paying attention to the history of glass and leaded glass, that's kind of that weird, that's where pretty much all the work is coming from. So this was my homage to all the different methods of working with craft, which, you know, it has like a candy dish of ceramics and
That's wonderful.
a metal tray, a blown glass cut in half. So I was thinking about the 5 different classifications that museums use for crafts are those elements. And then I was also told that paintings or, you know, craft doesn't go on the wall. Somebody at Lackman told me this. Craft doesn't go on the wall, craft goes on pedestals or on the floor, and so, you know, paintings could not be included in the collection, and that, or, you know, me, like this kind of work was kind of a dead end, you know, because I was like not enough, you know, I wasn't in the art world and I wasn't in the craft world, so it was a hybrid, you know. But
What year was that?
that was like 88, 89, something like that. Then I started like reducing all the complicated forms, and I was looking at microscopic diatoms and radiolaria, and so they're underwater, just really, that are beautiful. I'm sure you've all seen work like that. A lot of people have dealt with that since then. But so this was from a microscopic radiolaria. So it's carved foam that's clad with chunks of glass and a lot of layers of paint, so it developed this skin. I was very interested in this skin that also had, you know, the paint, but then the glass would like throw the light back. You'd go inside and then come back out with the glass. So this is another one. This is like sort of dead nature. Nature just wants to be brown after all. And so this is sink petal overripe. Sank being 5 sections. Diatomic bulge. And then going to these simpler forms, and then in the 90s I started thinking about my body and the issues about the body and the skin, which was happening a lot at that time also. But so I did a series of works about thinking about that. This is on the wall over here. This is Weight, W-E-I-G-H-T or W-A-I-T. It's a fetus in the womb. The womb is steel. The glass is cast glass in sand poured into a matrix of rolled up aluminum foil that became sort of like the placenta. But, you know, it was kind of like that's how it feels. That's a very heavy piece. And then the next piece, I actually used this blown glass piece. When I go to Pilchuck, I get to work with glass blowers, or when I go to residencies. So off and on, I have this intermittent work that's blown glass or more sculptural. So I took this blown glass peanut shape, it's fetus, but it's kind of like a little peanut too, and stuck that in the wet sand, and then they poured the molten glass to make Weight. This is called buoy, B-U-O-Y, and again, the metaphor. I was thinking about like Brancusi and how he has those very streamlined heads and how on a pillow, and so that there was a little bit of the influence of that. Sketches that I did at the time for the glass blowers were done in these are monoprints that I did in the print shop at Pilchuck off of, they're called vitriographs, which is a fancy name for just printing off of glass. I don't know if you could get a better effect off of glass than plexiglass, but some of these were done that way, where you etch the glass. So here's a string of boobs. Look, one of my favorite artists is Magritte, and I've sort of broken up that Magritte piece of the body. And then this was the piece that was that the glassblowers, who were Rich Royal, Pino Cineretto, and Loredano Rosine, some of the best glass sculptors from Italy, the latter two. They had a fight over how the tits should look. You know, I said I don't want it to look all perky, and of course it looks pretty perky. But it was that idea of like what size is the breast and graduated pearls, and you know, so there were some of that going on. This is after Magritte, called Face. He did a print called Face Phase. No, I called this Face Phase. He did a print called The Rape, where there's this confusion about the torso of a woman or the face of a woman. So, and this is just, I do little things like this. It's called Suspended Notion. It has a painting on glass of a woman with these simulated pearls the bathroom symbol for woman on the front. Working with Bill Morris and Dante Marioni. This was a bell jar from 1991. Every other person seems to do bell jars now, but anyway, it's a woman looking down. It's called Absence of Touch. So kind of like the regret of being touched or something, kind of sealing that touch forever in the bell jar. You can't really tell, but there's a man standing on the left who has got a sword, as if the hand implying that something had been cut off. These are baby bottles that are called metamorphosis, the cycle of life, the life cycle of an artist, and then so there's it would start off with pictures of my artwork and then evolve around to be a housewife living in a house, and then death. So in 1997, there were two artists, Monica Gugesberg and Philip Baldwin from France. Anyway, they were there doing this process called encalmo, where you attach two bubbles to get two or more glass bubbles together to get this really clean demarcation between one color and another. And I worked with Dante Marioni to get, this is my work table. I was teaching at the time. So I worked with him to make these pieces that had sort of like a tattooing or that kind of decorative markings on it. But basically, it was so much work to do this. I mean, Dante said it was really hard. So I went to the thrift shops and started making my own encalmo of attaching colors and shapes together. And I did, for 1997, my whole studio was pretty much filled with that kind of, I called them the stacks. 1998, we had moved from LA to Ojai, and I sort of became more insular. And when you live in LA, you live in a big city, you're seeing art all the time. It was so overwhelming at points where I just go, I'd have an idea and I'd spend the day at galleries and I go, oh, they already did that. I mean, they wouldn't have done it the way I did it, but it was just, you can almost get overwhelmed by seeing too much, and that's kind of the way I am, is, over input is, I can't stop myself. So this was actually, so I started going back to panels on the wall, and these are glass and mixed media. This was a tribute to my mother, ideas about underwater, and she had a dress when she died. This is a sequin fabric that she was going to make a fancy dress for herself that she never did, so kind of unfinished projects. And then a memory of wallpaper that's painted on glass with gold behind it. So that was a picture of her in several layers of glass, sort of capturing her hopefulness of imagery. And so I went through this period of doing all black and gold, or in this case, or gold and silver. Like, if art is precious, then let's make it out of precious materials. But it was just anything that was gold and silver. It wasn't anything really precious. So there's some thrift shop things, and gold leaf as a background. I used gold and silver lusters that I paint on the glass and fire. So, and painted on jewels, and then had it meandering and traveling around. Some mirror. So I do like the idea of looking into a piece and seeing yourself, looking at the piece. So you're part of the artwork, and there's this dialogue with glass that goes on. This is called Mother Nature, sort of the Church of the Daisies, and some kind of primordial female icon. Out of chaos, just where does creativity come from? It's Beethoven's ear trumpet, and then I copied a detail of his manuscript, his written music, which looks like a drawing to me. How could you possibly play that shape that's over there? 2001, I had this great opportunity. It was the first Hauberg Fellowship at the Pilchuck Glass School, and 7 of us got together and were able to paint for 2.5 weeks. Just there, it was great. So we were just other artists. Paul Marioni's on the right, for those who don't know who he is yet. Dick Weiss, and this is like 2012, we were asked back. So it was 11 years later.
Mhm.
That's Cappy Thompson and I. She's a great painter on glass. So we were all painting on glass. And they actually taught me how to really paint on glass and firing it in the kiln. So questions, the question, this is called the answer, which is really still a question. Compassion landscape. This is painting on glass mounted on top of drawing on wood. This was done right before 9/11, which this sort of sunflower in a cage. And there was a book I found of how to carry the wounded out of battle. This is Amand's chair. It's sort of like I'm the oldest of 5, and we were not allowed to sit in my father's chair. And this is another piece in the story called Flora, with different ways of thinking about plants and nature. And then the Garden of Eden, who's at fault? The snake or the woman? Why not the man? We lost paradise. What did paradise look like? A lot of pattern and decoration. 2004, a show at the Carnegie Art Museum in Oxnard. They had this wonderful place to put my stacks. And so looking through the stacks at another piece called Remnants, which is mixed media and glass on wood. Sort of a diary of different thinking about art or craft. Here's leaded glass on the wall, but I was also has this sort of dizzy background. I had a little bout with vertigo. So I was glad to have that piece in the show. But because of the museum show, and a lot of times when artists get the museum shows they have the opportunity to do bigger work or to do something that they haven't had the space to do. And this was the calendar series called Calendar Notations, and this is one piece of glass for 1 month of the year, but not the same year. And they were details off of my desk calendar that for years I had these paper desk calendars, and when I was talking on the phone or whatever, I would do these doodles. I wrote everything about my personal and business life on them. The thing that was important also was that they had these doodles on there, and the doodles to me are drawings that you're unconscious drawings that you're not aware of. So I would go back and look at, that's a good drawing. But I can't do that anymore because now I know when I'm doodling, and it's just like it's ruined it. But I did a whole series about doodles and or writing down information and drawing a frame around it, so that commissions for other people about their calendars, which it gets really personal, and several people backed off once they realized
What they had written.
yeah, but this was somebody else's kids' doodles and things like that. So this is so thinking about like calendars and just sort of inspiration that is just within an arm's reach. I started looking at the objects that I use in every day. And so I started to set up still lives in my studio from the bathroom or from the kitchen. And I was getting ready to do a residency at Pilchuck and the Tacoma Museum of Glass. So I had access to a lot of good glass blowers. And so what was I asking them to do is blow industrial made objects, which is like ridiculous. It's very hard to do. But anyway, so I went ahead and did these sketches from the still life, and then worked with glass blowers who actually they were oversized, so that Jean Naté bottle is probably 18 inches. But again, working with like Dave Walters and a number of people that are super great.
And you did all the writing on it?
Yeah, so then I'd engrave the glass and then rub it with oil paint because I was terrified to actually try to fire it in a kiln because I didn't want to lose the pieces. I had too much invested at that point. But I that's what I did for years, in the baby bottles and stuff, is engrave it with a diamond pointed Dremel and then rub it with, actually rub and buff, not oil paint. You know what rub and buff is?
No. What is
You
it?
can get it at craft stores.
Yeah.
It's something people, I don't know what you rub it on like frames and then you can let it dry and you can buff it so it's shiny, but it has a tenacity to it that's really good. It's, it's one of those silly craft things that turns out to be
Those are wonderful.
So this is from the medicine cabinet. And I started including some of the doodles on these. And part of the idea was that, we use all these objects in daily use, but I did some that had the painting them with the layered glass against the wall. This is, a light bulb metaphor for a good idea or the head. Again, thinking about Brancusi, but then I engraved. I printed on the pillow. This was back. I don't know what day. This was right after, Rumsfeld did all the thing and that whole poem thing that he said. It wasn't. There are also, there are unknown unknowns, things we don't know. So that's on the pillow. So the face that's on the solid glass light bulb, it's almost like it's asleep. The idea is asleep, and there's a dream, or a unconscious is behind his head. And I always like this piece. So these are pieces that I fired in the kiln. They're painted, and then they would be picked up. I started doing it inside the glass. So these ideas of the doodles and the text and all of that was then I'd fire all these little pieces of glass with things on them, and then the glass blowers would roll the solid glass over the pieces over and over again. I was starting to say that when we use these kinds of things, we don't think about squirting the squirt bottle unless it doesn't work. We're thinking about all other kinds of things. You're not thinking about cleaning or what am I going to have for dinner, or what am I going to do with that drawing I have going on. So it's this kind of swirl of the unconscious caught in common vessels or common things. So Joe Lauria curated a show for the Craft and Design.
Craft America.
No. This was up in San Francisco. The San
Oh, and
Francisco
that was
Museum.
Newbell Nuptial.
Newbell Nuptial. And so I started doing this series where I was painting on glass, and then it was mounted on the wall. And this had to do, I went online and pretended I was a bride and did all the things to got materials for this piece, which is it a formal wedding, a friend's backyard, exotic beach or church? Practice walking in your high heels before the event. Get insurance to make sure that you don't, if the thing falls apart. This is called The Neighborhood. Her dress is made up of a calendar or to-do list. I love painting that track house neighborhood. So this is called The Grocery Nude, and I've used her a lot in my work. She is over here as well. This is a more recent piece, but it's a figure that I stole from Magritte and stuck in a grocery cart. She'll be forever shopping. So there was a little bit of that going on, and then desire of commodities and things. This is called Looking Back at Modern. So it's kind of looking at this is called Want. This was 2008, back when, the financial crisis had happened, and just started thinking about what do I want and what do I need. So she's kind of disappearing. Architecture is falling apart. She's being crossed out. Her thoughts are blood red. Here's just a sketch of me in the studio painting. When I paint on glass, I paint on a light table with the drawing underneath, and so this is just multiple firings. Now, after that Hallberg fellowships and stuff, I'm really pretty much painting on glass primarily. Well, that may change. I think you can tell that I don't really do work that for decades that people then can easily recognize, and I think now artists pretty much skip around like that. There's not as much stigma about, there's so many artists that I could name that have done the same thing for decades, and collectors can recognize the work. They walk in, oh, you have a Michael Glancy, I have one too. It would be a lot harder to do that with artists that shift around, and the shifting comes from changing ideas about art, or changing ideas in your own head, or just seeing so much that I want to respond to that I can't stop. I can't stop shifting. So this was a detail with a photo decal and hand-painted shoe catalogs, and the swirl of paint. There's a detail oval here. This is I had a surgery. This is all in gold luster. You can't see it here so much, but it was all the schedule of drugs that I took post surgery. It was like OxyContin 2 o'clock. So, 2012, I did this commission for a couple in LA called the Gitnicks, and they had this collection of brilliant glass. It's cut glass. It's not very popular now. I mean, but it's also called brilliant glass, cut glass, and my favorite name is luxury glass. So that's what I call these some of the pieces that I've done. But so she loved. It was a commission. So commissions, I always like try to do what people think they need and what I think they need. But she loves flowers. Well, who doesn't love flowers? But flowers have been done by artists a lot. But these are actually plants that I got from Linda Taylor. They're who's sitting right there, a really great artist in Ojai. They're called Epiphylium?
Orchid cactus.
Orchid cactus. But whenever they bloom, I just feel compelled. They're giant too. The blooms are crazy. So I started working with them and his cut glass collection and the flowers to work on a series for this couple. And they wanted an entry, it's like stairwell thing. So this is 5 feet wide, 60 inches, and it's 3 layers of glass with mirror and then 2 layers of 1/4-inch plate that have been painted on both sides. So it's 4 layers of paintings with mirror behind it, but you don't see the mirror. The mirror is mostly like it just bounces back through the piece. So this is 1 of 3, and it was fired so many times. It took me 9 months really to do this. But so then I'm doing these pieces that include that include some of the blown glass or the cut glass or the optics of glass in my pieces that are called vignettes. And so I'm not sure where I'm really going with that. I'm also working on a series called Man View. Yeah, so there's the cut glass Eiffel Tower, which in this case just sort of comes off as, a phallic detail of this whole. I'm doing a series about men. They're called Man View, and there's one here that's behind you.
A man or a view?
Man View, and then it has the cut glass, the luxury glass. Anyway, and then those flowers, the orchid cactus that I love. There's the man as gentleman. There's the acupuncture chart man that I picked up in Chinatown, and then there's the over here. There's the dick man. This one of my grandsons left this drawing in my studio. I was like, who did this? Neither one would say that they did, but I loved it. So now I'm including. So the gentleman, the gentleman. And some of these, have this sort of connection to some of Paul's, where you have this sort of frontal view of the artwork looking back at you. He has, the frontal view of the mean mountain. Just sort of like there's a very simple gesture of the work looking at you or the work looking at itself, like confrontational in a good way. I mean, that's like person to person, artwork to person. This is called not words. It's words that aren't words. I don't know. Anyway, I just had to do it. I play with words with friends, and I'm always amazed how many words are not words. Just intrigued by that. So here's a quartet of the luxury glass. So basically, it's about optics, but it's not about optics. I've reduced the optics to decoration. I'm not quite sure the meaning of it. This diptych over here, which is from the luxury glass, I took a picture of a sugar bowl, a molded glass sugar bowl, which is on the left, and the reflection of it coming down, and then it turned into all these things. People say it's, it looks like a goat or something, and then just the silhouette shape of the whole thing on the right. So I can't really speak about it. I don't know. I just feel, like that's where I am. sort of this multiple imagery on one piece of glass and then this luxury glass. I just want to briefly show you, I've done some public art. I do this off and on, mostly when I'm asked. I don't like to compete. Anyway, so this was a crosswalk in Hollywood that I did in '94. I was a lead artist. This is the backdrop fence. This is all, it was part of a demonstration project, and now most of it's being dismantled because they're actually successful in Hollywood now. New developments came in, and this sidewalk, this was in the crosswalk. Because of this piece, they're never going to let artists do artwork in the street again. Because it was so, and then when the CRA got dismantled, then the city could do pretty much whatever they wanted with this. We're going to dismantle this in 90 days unless you claim. I got that letter.
Was that glass? What was it?
This was colored concrete with inlaid glass plugs and bronze. So it had this sort of carpet kind of luxury feel about it.
It's not gonna be there anymore.
It's halfway dismantled already.
Oh.
But you could probably see the remnants of it. But that whole backdrop fence, that got taken away.
What street is that on?
Ivar, where they farmers market. And this was to entry to a theater on Sherman Way, the Madrid Theater.
Oh, that's wonderful.
So that was some public art also. And interestingly, I never do. I really haven't done any public art with glass. Anyway, so this is I just finished last 2012 this mural at a development in Oxnard, and this was the shopping list mural in porcelain tile, and then I also did a sculpture fountain. That was the model, and that's the actual piece.
That's wonderful.
So, and just to say that the background of my work, I'm a mother and I've had 2 boys, 20 years apart, and they're a big part of my life. This is Wyatt with a sculpture. He's the younger, and a couple of his ceramic sculptures. And he has goblets next door, actually, like my son. And then my husband Richard, who actually, Richard and Wyatt were part of, were the installers and designers of, well, Richard was the designer of the show, but they installed it together, which is not easy, but it turned out great. And so these are some of his paintings. He's a painter. And then my older son, Jason, who is a creative director in advertising, he's the head of the Lexus campaign, so he's always like in shooting with cars somewhere. Anyway, so that's pretty much it. Thank you very much.